Today I am very excited that we have our panel here. So we have former Washington Center pitcher Don Lown, our other esteemed gentleman here, Jay Seaborg, who was the co-author of the first book-length biography, Ned Hanlon. It's a Hall of Famer, but underappreciated Hall of Fame manager of the Baltimore Orioles. And he is going to be talking some about his book, and he's been kind of traveling circuit. He talks about his book, and he's in various engagements as well.
Hi, before I started, just curious, how many of you know anything about Ned Hanlon? Have ever heard of him? Just a couple, all right. Ned Hanlon, and that's really why we wrote this book, Ned Hanlon is in the Hall of Fame. Hanlon started his playing career mostly in the 1880s, playing for the old Detroit Wolverines. And he was an all-star center fielder. He was a great fielder. He was, the Cedric Mullins of his day. He played at a time when pitchers threw underhand from 50 feet. The batter could call for a high pitch or a low pitch. Fielders did not have gloves. If you caught a foul ball on one hop, it was an out. So the rules were very, very different. But he was known as a great defensive center fielder. He stole a lot of bases. He stole over 300 bases in his career, and he only kept track of that statistic for the last 6 years that he played. His first 6 years, they didn't count. He went on to be on the world tour. Spalding sent his players from the Chicago team on a world tour in 1889, and he needed an all-star team to go along with them. And Hanlon was one of the players picked to be on the all-star team. He was the leadoff hitter. He was friends with the real star of that team, John Montgomery Ward, who was a shortstop for the Giants. During that trip, while the players were on that trip, they decided that they were going to challenge the reserve clause that we were just talking about. So in 1890, they started the Players League, which was a league run by players. And Hanlon was one of the guys that was responsible for getting financing for that league. It only lasted 1 year, and then it folded up. The National League, which was really the premier league at the time, basically bought out the owners of the Players League the next year. Some of them got franchises in the National League, some of them they just paid off to sort of go away. At the end of it, just a kind of an interesting little story, at the end of that league, Hanlon goes back to play for the Pittsburgh team, which is the team he was playing for before the league started. And there was kind of a gray area about where the players from the Players League belonged when they went back to the National League. Did they belong to their old team, or were they free agents? And there was a second baseman named Louis Bierbauer that Hanlon wanted to sign for Pittsburgh, but he was under contract to Philadelphia, or at least he had been before the Players League. So Hanlon tracks him down at a hunting cabin in upstate Pennsylvania in the middle of the winter, goes literally across a frozen pond lake to get to him, and he signs him to a contract with Pittsburgh. At that time, the Pittsburgh team was called the Pittsburgh Alleghenies. When the Philadelphia franchise heard about this, they said, this is a piratical act. And from that moment on, Pittsburgh was called the Pittsburgh Pirates. That's where that name comes from. In 1892, the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, Harry Vonderhorst, who owned a brewery, and he bought the Orioles as a way to sell beer. They were bad. They were a dysfunctional franchise. Players were showing up hungover. They were brawling with umpires. They were brawling with opposing players. And he wanted to put a winning team on the field. And he sent one of his beer managers out to look for a manager. And he went to Pittsburgh, and he heard good things about Ned Hanlon. Hanlon had been the captain on those old Detroit Wolverine teams. And in those days, the captains were the on-field managers. They brought in pitchers, they made defensive changes, all that sort of thing. And so Hanlon had a reputation as a thinking man's ball player. So they hired him to be the manager of the Orioles in 1892. Hanlon only took the job under the condition that he had total control of the team. He picked the roster, he negotiated the contracts, all of that. And so he takes over the Orioles in 1892. the end of May, I think, or beginning of June. And they were awful, just awful. So the rest of that year, he plays out kind of looking at his roster to see what he needed to do. This is where he gets the name Foxy Ned Hanlon from. Between the end of the 1892 season and the beginning of the 1894 season, he gets rid of almost everybody on his roster. There's only 3 players left by 1894. John McGraw, who was a utility player. Hanlon did not know where to play him. He played him in left field, he played him at shortstop, he played him at third base, he didn't have a position. Wilbur Robinson, who was his catcher, who's also in the Hall of Fame, as is McGraw, and his star pitcher, Sadie McMahon, who was most known for possibly killing a man in Delaware, but he was a good pitcher. That was it. Everybody else he got rid of. He started wheeling and dealing and making trades and making signings. He traded his star center fielder, a man named George Van Halteren. He traded him to Pittsburgh for an unknown outfielder named Joe Kelly, who becomes a future Hall of Famer in Baltimore. He trades with Louisville for a shortstop who couldn't hit his weight, named Huey Jennings, who becomes a Hall of Fame player in Baltimore. He trades with the Giants to get a left-handed third baseman who weighed about 140 pounds, named Willie Keeler, who he turns into a right fielder and becomes a Hall of Famer. And in that trade, he also got Dan Bruthers, who was already a star. He was towards the end of his career. And he puts together this team that in 1894 wins the National League pennant. Really, Hanlon puts Baltimore on the baseball map. Up until this time, they'd had teams, but they'd never been very good in any of the leagues that they were in. And the 1894 team came out of nowhere to win the National League pennant. And they did it using a style of baseball that was called scientific baseball, or inside baseball. And today, when you hear an announcer talking about a team playing small ball, manufacturing runs, that's Hanlon's program. And so it revolved around having high on-base percentages. He had guys with good eyes who knew what the strike zone was, stealing bases, using the hit and run, using suicide squeeze plays, using the Baltimore chop, which he taught to McGraw and Keeler, because they were both left-handed hitters and they were both really fast. And he taught them when they got certain pitches, hit it straight down into the ground and then just beat it out. There's a story, it's probably not true, but it might be, that Hanlon and the groundskeeper, Tom Murphy, dug a pit right in front of home plate and buried a block of cement in it and covered it over with dirt so that when they hit the ball down, it would bounce way up in the air.
Is that why they call it the Baltimore chop?
Baltimore chop was invented by Hanlon. Now, he did not invent the hit and run. He did not obviously invent the steal, but what Hanlon did that was different, and why the Orioles were known as a revolutionary ball team at the time, was he put all of these techniques together into a comprehensive program, a way of attacking the other team. He's also, as far as we could tell, the first manager to teach his pitchers to cover first base on a ground ball to the first baseman. It just normally wasn't done in those days. Nowadays, if a pitcher fails to cover first, you would invariably hear the color guy on the broadcast say, well, they go over that in spring training. Well, the reason they go over it in spring training is because Hanlon used spring training to teach his pitchers to do that. Nobody did that at the time. I mean, that's not revolutionary now, but it was in 1894. He also taught his pitchers to back up bases on throws from the outfield, which nobody did at that time. Pitchers were spectators after the pitch was thrown. Hanlon takes over the Orioles right at the time, just about the time, that they changed the pitching distance back to its present 60 feet 6 inches. It had been 50 feet. And they had just started throwing overhand not too long before that. So Hanlon's tactics come at a time when they're changing the game pretty drastically. And he realized that they needed new tactics. Up until that point, the tactic was basically get up and hit the ball as hard as you could. There was no science to it. So the Orioles win the National League pennant in 1894. They win it again in 1895. They win it again in 1896. And they come within a game and a half of winning it again in 1897. They go right down to the wire with the Boston Bean Eaters. In 1898, they finished second again, just by a couple of games. In 1899, the Baltimore franchise and the Brooklyn franchise consolidated. So both franchises are going to be run as one conglomerate. So Hanlon not only is going to go to Brooklyn and manage the Brooklyn team, he's going to own 10% of the Orioles and 10% of the Brooklyn franchise. Vonderhorst, the owner of the Orioles, owns 40% of both franchises. Charlie Ebbets Field, owns 40% of both franchises, and a guy named Frederick Abel owns the other 10%. So Hanlon goes to Brooklyn and takes 9 of the Orioles with him. Keeler goes with him, Kelly, Jennings, a few other players. But he leaves behind in Baltimore John McGraw and Wilbert Robinson, and Iron Joe McGinty as well. He was a pitcher that was a possible take for Hanlon, but he leaves him in Baltimore. He goes to Brooklyn. The year before he got there, they won 54 games. The year he gets there, they win 101. So he turns that franchise around, and they win the National League pennant again. And then in 1900, they win it again. So in a 7-year stretch, he wins 5 pennants. And his team was so good in Brooklyn that the sports writers took the name of a Broadway troupe that did acrobatics and all that were called Hanlon Superbas, and they started calling the Brooklyn team Hanlon Superbas. There's no relation between Hanlon and them. He has a couple more decent years in Brooklyn, but then Ebbets starts to meddle with his player moves. Players know that they can go around Hanlon and complain to Ebbets, and he won't back them up. And Ebbets had kind of a reputation as a little bit of a tightwad. There's a story where Hanlon, in the early 1900s, Hanlon and one of his friends go into Ebbets' office for a meeting, and Ebbets isn't there, but there's a $2 bill sitting on his desk. And the friend goes to Hanlon, Ned, what's that doing there? And Hanlon says, oh, Charlie took it out of his pocket to give it some air. He was afraid it was getting moldy. That's kind of what he was up against. So he stays there for a few more seasons, and then in 1905, at the end of that season, they let him go. He goes to Cincinnati and works for Gary Herman, who's another one of the early big names in baseball. It's not successful. And so after the 1907 season, he retires after 30 years in baseball. He then, while he was still managing, he bought the Montreal Royals, which was an Eastern League team, a minor league team. And he moved them to Baltimore and called them the Baltimore Orioles. By this time, the Oriole franchise had disappeared. The National League contracted Baltimore out of the league after the 1899 season, I believe, might have been 1900. And then when the American League starts, just a year or so later, there is a Baltimore franchise, but it only lasts for 2 seasons, and then they move to New York, where it becomes the Highlanders, where it becomes the Yankees. So there is some connection there. Anyway, so Hanlon moves this minor league team to Baltimore and renames them the Baltimore Orioles. And after a couple of years, he sells that team to Jack Dunn, who was one of his pitchers. In order to make ends meet, Dunn often sold his players to major league teams, sold their contracts to major league teams, including Babe Ruth. So Babe Ruth played for that Orioles team. Lefty Grove played for that Orioles team. There's a few other players that went up. Hamlin, after he gets Dunn, he sells that, and he's sort of semi-retired at that point. He does get involved in the Federal League, which was a short-lived league in the 19-teens. And he heads the Baltimore franchise, the Baltimore Terrapins. He owns the ballpark that they play in, Oriole Park, which burned down in 1944, I think, or 45. That's where the Peabody Brewery is today, on the grounds of that. When he gets done now, he gets appointed to the Baltimore Park Board, the city park board, where he eventually becomes the president. He hires his old center fielder, a guy named Steve Brody, to go around and scout out locations in Baltimore where he can build ball fields. And so he built ball fields all over the city. And they would often go around and see if anybody's using the fields. And if he saw some kids out there playing, Hanlon would take off his jacket, roll up his sleeves, and go out and coach them. He stayed active in baseball his whole life, and he lived in Baltimore till he died in 1937. So he had a real impact on baseball as it was changing from this kind of rough game of the 1880s that looked more like fast-pitch softball than it did modern baseball. He helps transition that into the modern game. As I said, his obituary, he was called, the father of modern baseball. His managerial tree, his modern managerial tree, includes most of the managers in baseball. Brandon Hyde, when he was still a manager, was part of that tree. He's only 4 branches removed from Hanlon. Casey Stangel's in that tree. John McGraw, of course, is in that tree. Huey Jennings, Wilbur Robinson, Miller Huggins, who managed the Yankees, played for Hanlon in Cincinnati. Kid Gleason, who managed the Black Sox, the 1919 White Sox team that was caught up in the gambling thing. He was Hanlon's second baseman and pitcher. Joe Kelly managed for years in the majors. He was a Hanlon ex-player. So all these guys went on to play. Now, one of the real impacts Hanlon has on the game, besides bringing these tactics in, is he invents modern spring training. Up until this time, up until the 1890s, teams would go south before the season started, somewhere warm, Arkansas or Texas or Georgia or someplace. But all they really did was loosen up for a couple of days. They'd play catch, take some infield and outfield practice, take some batting practice, and then they would play exhibition games to get themselves, they would just basically play themselves into baseball shape before the season started. What Hanlon decided he was going to do, because he had this new style of play that he wanted to bring in, was to take his team south. They went to Macon, Georgia, and for 2 weeks they ran 2-a-days. They had 2 or 3 hour practices in the morning. They would jog back to the hotel, eat lunch, take a nap, whatever. Then they would go back and do 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon, jog back to the hotel, have dinner, and then they would have chalk talks in Hanlon's room every night, where they would go over new rules, and they would go over strategy, and they would go over tactics, and they would go over how they're going to approach every situation you could think of. And he would encourage his players to throw their ideas in. And if Hanlon liked them, then he would put that into the program. But he taught very specific skill sets. So they would spend, they might spend 2 hours working on the hit and run, or 2 hours working on bunt plays and bunt defenses. Players would come from other teams. Dan Bruthers, who had played with Hanlon in Detroit, when he came over from the Giants, who were a good team, he was just astounded. He couldn't believe that they were working out like this. He said to Wilbur Robinson, "This is a heck of a way to treat someone who's worth $30,000, because they were doing all this running." A couple years later, Hanlon picked up a player named Dirty Jack Doyle from the Giants, who was also a really good player. And he came over and he watched one of the practices, and he turned to Joe Kelly and he said, "No wonder you guys don't lose games." He couldn't believe how meticulous Hanlon was about seeing to each of these things. So Hanlon had a huge impact on the game. He knows, he knows everybody of importance. Chadwick and Spalding and Comiskey and John Montgomery Ward. These are all people that Hanlon knew personally. So every big name in baseball from 1880 to the early 1900s passed through Hanlon's purview. He was also on the rules committee for years, and so every rule change that went through in the mid-90s to the early 1900s went through Hanlon's desk. There was only 3 guys on the rules committee, so he had a big impact. The one rule that he really pushed through, he was adamant about getting this rule pushed through, were foul balls or strikes. Before Hanlon got that rule changed, you could have 20 foul balls and you had no strikes. So at-bats could go on for quite some time. So his big thing was always he wanted games to go quickly. Hanlon thought if the game got to 2 hours, it was too long. So he would be I know he would be in favor of this pitch. That would have been right down his alley. His sweet spot for games was 1 hour and 45 minutes. He talked about going to a game that went 2 hours and 15 minutes and said he almost wore out the seat of his trousers shifting around because it was just taking too long. So I think the reason we wrote this book is Tom Delise, my co-author, he read a book called Where They Ain't, the story of the 1894 Baltimore Orioles. It's an excellent book if you're interested in 19th century baseball. And he got interested in Hanlon because he found out that Hanlon lived on Mount Royal Avenue, which is right around the corner from where he lived. And so when he got done, he did what most people do when they're interested in a topic. He went on Amazon and typed in Ned Hanlon because he wanted to get some books on Ned Hanlon. There aren't any. And so he started collecting information about him. Tom and I taught together. I was a teacher before I retired. And we taught at the same high school for about 10 years, and we found out we were both Oriole fans and Ravens fans, so we used to talk sports all the time. And after he retired about 4 or 5 years before I did, he sent me an email and said, hey, listen, I put together this baseball trivia game. Would you take a look at it if I give you, if I buy you lunch? If you're buying me lunch, okay, whatever. So we met at an ale house that was near the school one Friday afternoon after school was out, and what he had done is put together these 2,600 trivia questions about basically, they were all multiple choice, and one of the questions was, what former Oriole manager went into the Hall of Fame the same year as Earl Weaver? And it was, like A, Paul Richards, B, Hank Bauer, C, Ned Hanlon, D, Ray Miller. So I said, oh, it's Hanlon. Because you're the first guy that ever got that right. I said, I have no idea who Hanlon is. I just know the rest of them aren't right. I said, so who's Hanlon? And he said, well, he managed the 1894 National League champions. I said, oh, John McGraw, Willie Keeler. Like, I knew the team, I just didn't know Hanlon was involved. And that is kind of Hanlon's problem. He's he's a Hall of Fame manager that nobody's heard of. Tom and I have often said we could stand outside Camden Yards and ask 1,000 people going in who Ned Hanlon was, and I bet we would get 10 who's ever heard of him. So we decided we should write this book. So the book is about Hanlon's life. It starts out from his life as son of an Irish immigrant, working in a mill town up in Connecticut, all the way through, all the way up to his death in 1937. But in the book, not only do you learn about Hanlon, but you learn about 19th century baseball and that collection of great, colorful Oriole players from those 1890s teams. Those guys were characters, and they are just so interesting. And baseball was a rougher game then. It was not unusual, a guy hit a triple, we were run around first, the first baseman would trip him, and you get the second baseman would give him an elbow, and you get the third, and the guy would push him off the bag. John McGraw, who was Hanlon's third baseman, was famous for grabbing players' belts when they tried to tag up on a sacrifice fly. And so one of the players knew that, and he undid his belt, took off, and McGraw's left holding the belt while the guy goes home. But those Oriole teams revolutionized the way baseball was played at the time. Hanlon's tactics become dead ball tactics right up until the live ball era with Babe Ruth in the 1920s. That's the tactics everybody used because Hanlon was successful. And then his players like Jennings, who took the Tigers to 3 World Series, and McGraw, who took the Giants to, I think, 6 altogether World Series, and Robinson, who took the Dodgers, or the Robins as they were called at the time, to the World Series in the 20s, and Huggins took the Yankees. They all used Hanlon's tactics. When, if you guys remember Billy Martin back in, I guess it was the 80s, playing Billy Ball out in Oakland, that's inside baseball. That's scientific baseball. And so we thought there was a niche for this book, and so we put it together, and we're hoping that people will get interested in Hanlon and get interested in that Orioles team and get interested in 19th century baseball. It's a fascinating era because it is the 1890s in particular is that transitional era from what really didn't look like baseball to modern baseball. Before 1900, baseball was a national pastime. After 1900, it was the national pastime. And when I was a teacher, we'd get to the take the NFL today and triple it, and you're getting close to where baseball was in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And baseball was the game, the sport. Everybody followed it, everybody played it. And Hanlon had a big role in that. We think he took him so long to get to the Hall of Fame because he died in 1937. Hall of Fame had barely started, so 19th century managers sort of got, that's kind of the dark ages for baseball. So you got sort of pushed to the side. So anyway, so that's the Hanlon story in the Foxy. He got so good at doing trades, by the way, just the Foxy Ned moniker. He was so good at doing trades that after a while nobody would trade with him because they knew they were going to get ripped off. They knew that he would trade something that would end up having no value and giving something of value in return. At one point, Hanlon went around to the winter meetings and he proposed trades to every team. These really one-sided trades where he was trading his superstars for guys on their team that they weren't very good. They all figured he had something up his sleeve so nobody would bite. They all figured, well, if he wants to trade this guy, he must know something about him. We don't, like he hurt his elbow or something. So, anyway, that's Ned Hanlon.